My mother still regrets that we didn't speak more Hebrew in the home. My parents sent me to Jewish school. I learned Hebrew. I understand it quite fluently, but I would have benefited from more casual speaking at home. Certainly, my word retrieval could have become more natural. So why didn't we do it? My mother says it's because she wanted to fit in America, or she was made to feel she had to fit in. You see, my father's family is wonderful. They embraced my mother. She is forever grateful for how they helped her as a recent immigrant from Israel. But along with the much-needed support, there was a subtle disdain for the culture and place from which she came. You're in America now, she was told, and in America we speak English. She watched the Howdy Doody show, and she learned English quite well, but we would have benefited from a little more Hebrew in the home. And it isn't just the language. My mother's family came to Eretz Yisrael from Iraq, my grandfather in 1936, my grandmother a little later, and I know almost nothing about their story. The religious influence was entirely from my father's side, Ashkenazic, from Poland and Russia, partly because my grandfather, for whom I am named, was an incredible influence on my father, and partly because his Ashkenazic practices were considered normal, while the Mizrahi traditions of my mother's family were considered strange. And not just in my mother's family, in my family. The American Jewish community is and was Ashkenormative in outlook. Descendants of German and Polish and Russian immigrants are the clear majority here. Even in Israel, where the Sephardi and Mizrahi ethnicities represent more than 60% of the population, the light-skinned Ashkenazis from Poland and Germany represented the Zionist elite, especially in the 1950s and 60s when my mother was growing up. There are still today leftover grievances from that period in Israel. That's not my focus this morning. My point is just that this rich, interesting part of my identity was downplayed when I was growing up. And it's a shame because mine is far from the only example. There are so many others who live in our community who want to be a part of our community, and sometimes we just don't see them. We don't fully appreciate the contributions they might make if we could get them in. In a little bit, the cantor is going to chant Unatana Tokef, perhaps the most recognizable liturgical piece of the day. Before we get to the part about who will live and who will die, the poet imagines God sitting on the divine throne. V'chol ba'ei olam ya'avrun lefanecha. All the inhabitants of the world pass before you, we read. A line comes from the Talmud, which supports it with a verse from Psalms, calls God the one who fashions hearts and understands all of humanity's deeds. What does it mean that the entire world passes before God? It means that God does what most of us fail to do. God looks at a group and sees individuals. God discerns difference. God sees folks on the margins whom society too often renders invisible. God values the contributions and potential contributions of all people, not just the ones in front. You've probably heard some version of the story of a child from another community coming to B'nai Israel on a Shabbat morning and pointing to the bima and asking her mother, "Who's that guy standing up there?" When the mother answers, "That's the rabbi," the child looks at her and says, "Really? You mean men can be rabbis?" 50 years ago, it was only men. The transition towards including women on the pulpit means more than just allowing them to join the rabbinate. Ordaining women meant inviting the female leadership voice into the conversation. It meant inviting women to render opinions on matters of Jewish law and to respond to texts where the female voice is clearly absent. For example, did you know that women's desire to marry is stronger than men's? Yeah, I didn't know that either, but that's what the Talmud says. More than a man wants to marry, a woman wants to marry. And I seriously doubt that statement would have made it in if women had been invited to the Talmud's editorial committee. Once upon a time, it was enough for a feminist reading of the Bible to just point out the female characters and leaders, from Sarah to Deborah to Ruth. But that isn't enough today. A more proper feminist reading acknowledges the relative absence of the female voice, even when we see the character's name, and imagines how our sacred stories might have been told differently through a woman's perspective. We'll see it in tomorrow's reading when Abraham gets up early in the morning to bring Isaac to Mount Moriah to be sacrificed. What would Sarah have said if she had been asked her opinion of God's command? Or what did she say at a dinner conversation the night before that was left out of the text? We'll never know. But we can imagine, and we must imagine, what those once silenced voices would say. Now, it's notable that even as the human biblical characters discount the woman's voice, God doesn't. In today's reading, God said to Abraham, "Whatever Sarah tells you, shma bekolah," listen to her voice. It's complicated because Sarah asks for something that seems so harsh, but we can't help but notice how God values Sarah's perspective. After Hagar and Ishmael are cast away and they're wandering in the desert without food and water, God sees them. God blesses them. God opens Hagar's eyes and she discovers a spring. A few chapters earlier, the first time Hagar was banished from Abraham's home, God also appeared to Hagar. Hagar named that place Be'er Lachai Roi, a well to the living God who sees me. She named her son Ishmael, which means God hears, to emphasize that God hears and sees and values all creatures, even the ones who are cast aside and rendered invisible. God's example becomes our challenge. For me, this is the reason we include the matriarchs in the Amidah. I never imagined I would get to the point where it sounds funny for me to hear the Amidah without Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. They were missing from my prayer for most of my life, and I didn't really notice. It makes me ask, who are the others we fail to notice? In August, I attended a conference of the Multi-Faith Neighbors Network. Our hosts explained they used the term multi-faith instead of interfaith because interfaith implies having to give something up in order to join the group. Multi-faith means appreciating the blessings of connecting with people who are different without asking them or them asking me to change. We were split into groups by religion and asked to write a sermon on peace. So our Jewish group began by looking at the word shalom, which shares a root with the word shalem. It means complete. Peace, we posited that peace means inclusion. Peace means belonging. Peace is achieved when diverse peoples learn to live together and appreciate their differences. Over time, our understanding of community has expanded to include women, but also LGBTQ+, immigrants, and multi-faith interactions. Peace will come when hatred ends. That's why we have to fight anti-Semitism. Yasser Arafat, Jimmy Carter, and Menachem Begin were on an airplane and was about to crash. Yeah, you can't tell that joke anymore. Sorry. The punchline involves 2 parachutes and a tallis bag, but it isn't appropriate for a sermon about belonging or peace. Reminds me of the rabbi who was once approached by the president of the synagogue on the morning after a board meeting to be told that the board had decided they weren't going to give the rabbi a raise. And the rabbi was, of course, disappointed, so he tells the president, I was counting on that raise. After all, I'm just a poor preacher. To which the president responds, well, that's exactly what they said after your sermon last Shabbat. 20 years ago, the discussion was about homosexuality. People expressed discomfort with a Torah verse that appears to prohibit homosexual activity. And we learned to interpret that verse in new ways. Some suggested at the time that homosexuality wasn't an issue for suburban communities like ours because they don't live here. But that's a farce. Our understanding of who belongs in the community expanded. It expanded to include transgender, and not just to include. We had to train ourselves to be more understanding, more welcoming, to use people's preferred pronouns even when it might make us uncomfortable, to affirm people's right to be themselves, express themselves, and feel safe and valued as children of God while doing so. With leadership from Cantor Bolts, we're forming a belonging committee for the synagogue. Expanding on the disability work of our inclusion committee, we've identified 4 areas on which to concentrate. Inviting more Jews of color, sexuality and gender identity, the broad range of observance and education levels among our membership, and including the non-Jewish members of our families in synagogue life. Belonging is not as simple as putting up a sign, and I encourage people to join the conversation. This may be a challenging message in our polarized world, so I want to affirm the value of ideological diversity as well. We tend to be suspicious of those who present differently or espouse contrary views, but this may be an area where conservative Judaism has something to contribute. Of all the movements, ours is the one committed most to Jewish pluralism. Do you know that our Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is comprised of 25 voting members, but an opinion only requires 6 affirmative votes to be considered authoritative? So do the math. There can be 4 legitimately approved opinions, sometimes in opposition to one another. Some conservative congregations use musical instruments on Shabbat, while others say the practice is prohibited. That's pluralism. We value the big tent and expect that members of our community will have different views about politics and tradition and law, and we welcome and affirm them all. The Talmud says this is how it's supposed to be. No singular authority can definitively tell us what is right or wrong or kosher or treif. It's up to us as individuals to consider all the opinions. In the Talmud's words, Aseh oznecha ka'afar keset, make your ears like a hopper, able to take in all the different opinions and distill them down to your own measured view. Those who disagree are not necessarily wrong. They simply draw different conclusions. Need a proof text? When God gives the 10 Commandments, we read, Vayedaber Elohim et kol hadevarim ha'ela. God spoke all these words. Says the Talmud, all the interpretations, all the rulings, all the opinions are rooted in the same Torah, given by the same God. We have to make room for opposing viewpoints. Sometimes that means learning to love the in-your-face contrarian, and other times it means training our eyes to see people who might otherwise be invisible. My friend, the late Esther Kravitz, spoke this way about mental illness. She called it a no-kugel disease. You see, when it's not like other illnesses, where people line up outside the door and offer support and want to bring food. Too often, individuals suffer from mental illness or addiction in the shadows. The numbers are staggering. Statistics shared from Jessa suggest that 1 out of 7 10 to 19-year-olds experiences a mental disorder. And suicide is the 4th leading cause of death in 15 to 29-year-olds. Too often, their suffering goes unnoticed, and it's a problem because feeling invisible is literally bad for your health. And that's why it's so important for us to learn to emulate God, who on Rosh Hashanah sees and honors all beings. Jessa offers its J-Caring hotline, and the B'nai Israel clergy want to help as well. Here's our simple message. If something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. But if you feel like nobody notices or nobody cares, that's where you're wrong. We love you. We want to see you. And if you come to us, we will listen before we start rattling off advice. There is this scene in Exodus when Pharaoh is ready to send away the Israelites, and he challenges Moses with one final question. Mi vami haholchim, he asks, who exactly is going with you? When Moses says it will be everyone, men, women, children, old, young, animals, everyone, Pharaoh says no. The men can go with you, but that's it. And a commentary imagines Pharaoh trying to reason with Moses. You don't want to take the children, he says. They make too much noise. They get in the way. Just leave them at home. Your community is big enough. You have enough things to worry about. But Moses is adamant. All of them means everyone. And the plagues continue until Pharaoh relents. The challenge is that evil Pharaoh is not the only one in history to leave folks out. Think of this country's founding. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Who was included? Who was left out? Look around the sanctuary. Who are the folks we want to get to know better this year? Who might need our support if they are to express their full selves? Who isn't here because they fear that ours is not the community for them? How can we expand to include more diversity within our sacred home? V'chol ba'ei olam ya'avrun lefanecha. On this sacred day, all the inhabitants of the earth pass before a loving God who sees and discerns and appreciates and judges and blesses. Black Jews, white Jews, brown Jews, Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews, non-Jews, he, she, they, gay, straight, cis, trans, conservative, liberal, progressive, individuals with remarkable abilities and those with disabilities, all are creations in the image of God. All belong in God's sanctuary. And so it is up to us to hear the message and act upon it so we may all be blessed. May this year be a year of health, joy, and growth for all of us. Shana Tova.